experienced it in the pew. I've experienced it from up here. And it hasn't always been great. There have been good times, don't get me wrong. But there have been some incidents that would have led and have led other men to leave the ministry and perhaps God's church altogether. I remember in the winter of 1984, I was at my second ministry. We had 2 young kids, and we had a third one in the oven, and we were living in an old farmhouse in Ohio, and we just didn't have enough money, and Kim's dad was actually sending his tithe check to us every week so that we could put fuel oil and heat the house. And at that, we had moved downstairs, put curtains over the stairway, and had a kerosene stove going on so that the house could be at least almost livable. And I remember calling one of the elders one night and saying, you know, we've got to have some fuel oil. I'm out. I'm totally out. And he said, well, we have to call a missions meeting because that's a missions decision. And then he showed up a couple hours later with about 10 one-gallon jugs, milk jugs of number 2 heating fuel, and dumped that into the tank and said, this will take care of you till we have the missions committee meeting. I'm rather naive. You really have to punch me pretty hard in the face for me to be offended. And even at that, I'm thinking, oh, missions meeting, I get it. And I ran that by the guy that baptized me, and he says, how stupid are you? They don't want you there. They're freezing you out with your family. Get out of there. And so I did. About 13 years ago, on my birthday, as I got up to preach, as I do here every week now, we were going to have a congregational meeting immediately following, and all the elders, 4 or 5 of them, and my staff, all 2 of them and their spouses, got up, walked out the door, put on their coats, and left the church never to return. And I remember walking around the building kind of going, something really weird just happened here. And they never came back. And to this day, I do not know what their argument was. They never would tell me. And I could see some people leaving the church and leaving the ministry and saying, I have enough trauma and drama and chaos in my life. Do I really need any more from the church? I say that to empathize with lots of people who have turned their back on church for good reasons. I don't know about you, but I bump into them all the time. They used to go to church, but now they're called the duns. They're fed up for one reason or another. And I too have good reasons to leave the church if I really wanted to dwell on them. But I didn't. And I haven't. And I won't. And I want to talk a little bit about why I won't leave the church. Because I am convinced that the local church is how God changes you and how God changes the world. And how God changes me as well. Now, it can be hard sometimes to see that. But I think that's really what Scripture teaches. Now, I got to share with you one of the most encouraging verses I have when it comes to hanging out in churches is this one here from Matthew chapter 13. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown into the water and caught fish of every kind. And when the net was full, they dragged it up onto the shore. They sat down, they sorted the good fish into crates, but they threw the bad ones away. He's talking about the church there. I believe that most of the time when you read the word kingdom in the New Testament, you can interplay that with the word church, and it's going to make a lot of sense. I think he's talking about the church. Back when I lived on PEI in the 1990s, I went out several times with Brian Ohl and his dad Earl. And I'll never forget watching what comes out of a lobster trap. It's not just lobster that go in there. There are trespassers underwater, you know. All sorts of ugly fish that have no business being on earth. And I don't know, I think the one I saw was kind of like the one on the far right here in that picture. But I remember freaking out when I saw that thing, and they were like, no big deal, you catch all sorts of things. And that's the moment when this passage from Matthew 13 really came alive for me. This is how I see the church. It's got all sorts of great fish that we can't wait to fry up and eat. Kind of a mixed metaphor. And then it's got all sorts of ugly, blobby, teethy, sharp, bitey fish that just are going to be thrown out and you hope you never see them again. And that's what I think of when I think of the church. And so when I come across one of these in the church, I go, oh, it must be a New Testament church. Jesus warned us. We're all fish. We're all caught. Peter was going to be what? A fisher of men. And the net comes in, and this is what we got. And they dump it out at a place like this. And just take a look at your neighbor and say, hey there, fish. Now, I'll leave it for you to decide if I'm, one of those ugly fish that ought to be booted out, or I'm one of the desirable ones. And you keep your opinion to yourself, and I'll keep mine to myself. Last week, we saw the church was established as a movement centered around a simple message: the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins of the world, as was shared this morning from 1 John chapter 3. And we saw that it didn't take long for the church to become identified with the location and with buildings, and it became more and more concerned with structure and hierarchy and political power than in changing lives through the message of the gospel. And eventually, through the efforts of a lot of people, including, we had mentioned William Tyndale and others, the masses of people were given access to the Bible, and much needed corrections were made to the concept of church, and so that it would better reflect what God intended it to be, a movement again in the lives of those being changed by the message of Christ. And the issue that we have today in North America, America and Canada, we face a different challenge, perhaps. Lots of people attend church on the weekends. They like the benefit of the music, they like the benefit of the message, but they refuse, especially in this day and age of the internet, and you can listen to all the good speakers on your phone. They refuse the responsibility that comes with commitment. I call them church flirts. They have no interest in settling down in one church, and their eye is always roaming to see if maybe there's one they like better. Josh Harris wrote a book, YChurch Matters, Discovering Your Place in the Family of God. Josh used to minister right down the road from where I lived in Maryland. I've always admired him for a long time. His family were pioneers in the homeschooling movement down in the States. He said, today we live in an increasingly fragmented world. That mindset has influenced the way we approach our relationship with God. Faith is a solo pursuit. These days, he writes, experts describe America as a nation of believers, not belongers, and the numbers confirm it. According to Barna, while the adult population of the United States increased by 15% during the 90s, the number of adults who either didn't attend church or only went on major holidays increased by 92%. Something happened in church life in America, and I think that Canada tends to be a little bit ahead of where America is on the church and on the spiritual front, and I think that these numbers probably are fairly accurate for what you've experienced north of the border as well. Josh offers a profile of what he calls church daters. They're those who are me-centered, and they're just concerned with what the church can do for me. And there's those who are independent. They avoid involvement with people. There's minimal relational investment. You see them here on Sunday morning, but then does anybody really know them? I had a small church down in Maryland. It maybe was 60, 70 people. That's a small church, and there were people there I never knew. Why? Because they had the independent. They didn't want to be known. And then, of course, there's the critical profile. This is the consumer mentality. They're fickle. They're not invested for the long term, and they just evaluate everything on a scale of 1 to 10, and they're quick to let you know where you messed up. Josh has a friend named Nathan who attended 2 churches on Sundays. I give the guy credit for pursuing his spiritual passion. He went to one church for the music, and he went to the other church for the preaching, and he had a minimal commitment to both. I call that a religious narcissist. It's all about him. Do you know anyone like that? It's all about them. Now, the danger of this consumer minimal commitment mindset is it cheats you and it cheats the church and it cheats the world. Because I believe that the church is God's greenhouse. The best context for you to flourish spiritually. It's where God grows you and conforms you to look like Jesus Christ. When do you start a plant? You don't just put it outside of the elements, you start it in a controlled environment. He writes this, the church community is where we learn to love God and others and where we're strengthened and transformed by truth from the Word, where we're taught to pray, taught to worship, taught to serve, where we can be most certain that we're investing our time and abilities for eternity, where we can grow in our roles as friends and sons and daughters and husbands and wives and fathers and mothers. The church is earth's single best place. God's specially designed place to start over, to grow, to change, for the glory of God. Have you ever thought of that? Church is God's single best place. Now, when you keep your distance from church, there's a lot of stuff that God would love to do in your life through that church that just won't happen. There's this myth out there that says God is all I need. And it sounds spiritual. But it makes God a liar, because God saved you through the church and God grows you through the church. And he calls the church his body. And he says you need to be connected to it intimately or the whole body suffers. It's a myth. You need more than God. Where else are you going to be challenged to forgive people who hurt you? Where are you going to get that? Where are you going to be challenged to accept people who aren't like you? Where are you going to be challenged to see the best in others? What other group can you give your time and energy to that cares about your soul, that cares about your eternity, that cares about your conscience, that cares about right and wrong? Where else are you going to go that will steer you to the Bible as your primary guide in life? Everyone else says, be true to yourself. My wife had a poster like that in our house one time. I made her take it down. My Bible says the heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? Like, I don't want to go by my feelings. Where else are you going to be challenged like that? Whatever makes you happy. No. Whatever pleases God. The church says you are made to honor God with your life, and until that happens, you'll be miserable and unfulfilled. Where else are you going to go to get supernatural and even unnatural wisdom and priorities? What other group is going to prepare you for the grave? What other group is going to urge you to live with one eye on eternity and things that really matter? What other group is going to love you through your doubts and your darkest, blackest, most shameful, humiliating moments? What other group is going to walk with you through the traumas of life? My wife was talking with my secretary from her church in Maryland this afternoon, and we discovered that there's a couple there. They were, I would put in the independent category. Nobody really knew them. They came for years. And they weren't there for a couple of weeks, and finally someone reached out to them. Said, what's going on? Come to find out, she's got dementia. And he made arrangements to have someone stay with her, so he came and could share with the church. And now I know there's people down in that congregation, now that they know this, are making arrangements. Well, who's available throughout the day to spell him, to go over and sit with her, to make sure she doesn't hurt herself? That's the church. That's a good thing. Paul David Tripp, I like to read his blog writing, says your life is much bigger than a good job, an understanding spouse, non-delinquent kids. It's bigger than beautiful gardens, nice vacations, fashionable clothes. In reality, he says, you're part of something immense, something that began before you were born and will continue after you die. God is recruiting fallen humanity, transporting them into his kingdom, and progressively shaping them into his likeness. And he wants you to be part of it. That's what happens when you go to church. That's what happens when we meet together. Do you have that sense, that picture of what church should be, what church is, what God intends? Have you ever thought about what life-changing ministries won't take place because you never made the commitment to be generous and disciplined with your money through giving to your local church? Have you ever considered that there are people far from God who will only be reached by someone just like you? But if you don't make yourself available to God's number one priority, which is changing lives through the simple message of the gospel, then there's going to be people who will spend an eternity separated by God because you only flirted with the church instead of making a commitment to it. When you're not here, and I know I'm preaching to the choir because you're here on a Sunday night. I get that, but people listen to this once in a while online, so. But if you're not here, there could be a divine appointment that doesn't get met because there's someone that you could meet. Do you get along with everybody in church? Raise your hand if you get along with everybody in church. Liars. That's okay. There's someone out there that needs what we have here that won't be attracted to me or drawn to me, and that's okay because they might be drawn to you, and that's you're who they need. And there's people that will be attracted and drawn to me and maybe not to you, and that's okay based on my personality and your personality and our background and everything about us. God made you and gave you the experiences just the way you are because there's someone out there who will connect with someone just like you. And so that's why it's important to be with the body when we gather and we have guests. Dean McKinnon was here 2 weeks ago for the open house. Do you know what he and his wife do every Sunday when they go to the Cornwall Church? This blew me away. They prepare a meal at home, and they're looking for someone that they don't know to invite home. Now, I imagine sometimes there's not a guest, so they probably take someone they don't know real well, or maybe it's someone they actually do know, but it's the mindset that they're walking through those doors and they're thinking, God, maybe today's the day. Connect us with somebody who needs a relationship. And through that relationship, they'll find a relationship with you. Could you imagine if a whole bunch of us just started doing that? Now, in my case, it'd be kind of awkward because I'd have to take them all the way back to Charlottetown, but you are without excuse. Well, no, actually, some of you live pretty far away, too. But you see what I'm saying? Everybody I know that's doing anything significant for God began with an overwhelming sense of helplessness, inadequacy, a someone can do it better than me mindset. But they looked around and they saw that nobody else was doing it at all. And so they stepped up and they made themselves available to God 100%. I think of Karen Bolche. If you're on my Facebook page, your friend on Facebook, you got a friend, Karen Bolche. She went to the Dominican Republic. She was an accountant in Mississauga, for Pete's sake. But she went on vacation, and she heard how terribly they talked about the Haitians. And so she thought, well, I have time. I have money. Let me cross the border and see what's so bad about the Haitians. And she fell in love with them. And now for like the past 20 years or so, she has run a mission on hell's doorstep. Just miles from Cité Soleil, one of the worst slums in the world, one of the most dangerous places in the world. She's had her own workers, she's had colleagues shot outside her gates. And she has a medical clinic and a school and an orphanage, and she coordinates medical care for doctors that come from all over North America, and she does amazing things. How qualified was she for any of that? Nada. She'd be the first to tell you. But her heart was open to be the hands and feet of God. And I could repeat that story over and over. Now, you don't have to go to Haiti. You don't have to go to Sri Lanka like I'm going next week. You don't have to go to Burma. You don't have to go to Guatemala. You don't have to go to Romania. You know there are great ministry opportunities right next door, and you're doing them already. I think of Shane and Velda in the soup kitchen. I think of Guy and Claudia and doing their VBSs, their passion for the kids. I think of Neil and Art and their ministry. Maybe some of you aren't even aware that their ministry to being a handyman and seeing the needs of neighbors and being the first on the scene and making it happen. That's being the church. Back home, I had a friend of mine, he loved his church had an annual week of service. He looked forward to that thing. My home church is finally going on the Appalachian Service Project. I went down there about 9 years ago with a couple friends, Jeff Clark from St. John and my brother-in-law, and we went down and into Appalachia and just rebuilt homes. We paid the money to go there, and then we paid for the supplies, and then we did it. But now my church is catching it, and now some of them are going. I put up on Facebook here just, I think, yesterday or the day before, the Kings Valley Church down in St. John. They have a love week. It's called Helping on Hampton. Their goal was to raise $50,000 so that they could give back to local charities. Not even necessarily Christian organizations, but people that were doing a good work and making St. John a better place. They wanted to raise $50,000. They raised $65,000. And they had a great video of them going around and giving away $10,000 checks to all these organizations that weren't expecting it. And they wanted to gain 1,000 volunteer hours from their congregation of people serving in the community, and they got over 1,300 hours. And when you do stuff like that, when you get involved in just helping and being the hands and feet of God in a community, you touch lives and you build amazing relationships with people in the church and people outside the church who are watching you. Maybe people you only knew superficially, but now you're working together for a higher purpose. But you have to decide to be available. You have to make a commitment to whatever it takes for God to use you. And what we do often, I know I've done this myself, God, I want to be used by you to make a difference in the world. Here it comes. But, and then we put in the asterisk and we go down to the fine print. I won't go here, I won't do there, I won't do that. Definitely won't do it with that person. And we give them all the qualifications, all the qualifiers. Well, I want to be used by you. But God wants to answer the I want to be used by you part, but he doesn't want to mess with the qualifier part. And the thing is, I'm afraid that if you say no to too many opportunities, you may never have another chance, because I think God may just pass you by and find someone who's willing to go, and all of a sudden you'll get to the end of your life and say, you know what, I never really did step outside my comfort zone. I never really did take a risk. I never did really push the envelope. I never really did make much of an impact for Jesus. Not like I know I could have, not like I know I wanted to, not like I dreamed about when nobody was looking. Jesus warned against this in Matthew 25. He talked about these guys that buried their talents. Do you remember that? Do you remember the guy that was blessed? Do you remember the guy that was the good guy, wore the white hat in that story? What separated him from the others? Risk. Risk. To get the amount of return on his investment meant he had to bet it all. And we sit there and say, God, I want to give you everything. But then we hedge our bets, and we wonder why we don't do much. I think of Natasha in Operation Shoebox. I need to make a phone call, by the way. I got to do church affirmation phone calls and see how it's going. I'll do mine right now. You okay? You good for next year? Yeah. For Operation Shoebox? Okay, that's done. Thank you. Yeah, I know. Many of you have worked with Natasha on that, and you know the overwhelming sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that brings. I mean, my wife has gotten to go to Moldova and visit a mission that rescues teenage girls from the sex trade. Who knows what God has in store for you? Will you make a commitment? God, I want to be your hands and feet and no buts. God's got plenty of butts. He doesn't need the butts. He needs the hands and the feet. Because there's a world desperate for his touch, but he only touches through you. See, that's why we need the church. It's not just about you and God. It's the church that touches the world. It's the church that feeds the poor, that builds the houses. It was the church that saved me. They took in a stupid college kid who was just a party animal, and they didn't laugh me out of there, and they loved me, and they showed me a better way, and they believed in me. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul describes the church as a bride, cherished and nurtured by her groom, who is Jesus. Now, I know thinking this way about your local church can be hard. I know that many churches are characterized by negative experiences, personality conflicts, power plays, petty bickering over things that don't matter at all, scandals and disappointments from leaders that you thought you could trust. I get all that. I've been there. I've experienced that. But you can't live there. You can't live in the disappointment that some church laid on you at some point in your life. Even if you've been sexually abused in a church, and I know people where that has happened to them. And some of you know what that's like. And you know you can't live there. It's got to be dealt with and moved on. You've got to learn to see the church as God does, with all its faults, with all its wrinkles, with all its blemishes. He sees it as a radiant bride. A few chapters earlier in Ephesians chapter 3, this is what Paul writes. He says, I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given me through the working of his power, and although I'm less than the least of all God's people, this grace was given me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. His intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose, which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. Somehow, through what happens here, and in thousands of local churches, just like the Montague Church of Christ, all over the world, somehow what happens here, there's a heavenly audience that looks down on us with utter amazement. Amazed that selfish people become givers. Amazed that hateful people become lovers. Amazed that lost people get found. That wounded people become healers. That nasty people become kind. That prejudiced people become colorblind or ethnic blind. That enemies embrace and become friends, or better yet, family. What happens in church when it's done right causes our heavenly witnesses to go, oh no, man, I just lost another bet. Doggone it. I just knew she wasn't going to forgive him. No way they were going to hug. Now what this tells me is you have an opportunity to make an angel gasp. Never thought of it that way, did you? Here's what I want you to do. The next time you're offended by a church person, someone ticks you off, whatever it is, doesn't matter, legitimate or not. We all do it. The Bible has over 70 references to one another. Forgive each other, accept each other, love each other. Next time someone rubs you the wrong way, would you say, whoa, 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 look up. This is an opportunity to make an angel gasp. This is an opportunity to show the difference that God makes in our lives, because before I used to put the knife in your back. You smack me, I'll... My middle name is Grace. Jamie, I didn't mean to destroy your stage, but you got to forgive me. That's the... I'm serious. Because it's the relationships that drive a lot of people. I put a question on the other day on Facebook about, why do you think it's important to stay connected with your local church? And my wife made a statement about, I think most people are turned off by people, not God. And she's bang on. When you think about the problems that you've had in your local church, whether it's here, whether it's wherever you are, whether you're visiting from somewhere, it's people. If there just weren't people. But that is an opportunity for you to grow and be transformed and to act out kingdom values instead of carnal values and worldly values. And so my encouragement to you is when people just make you want to put your fist through a wall or pick up the phone or be nasty, remember, someone up there is laying bets on you. Make them gasp. Just go up and put your arms around them and say, hey, what's the win-win here? I love you. Can't stand what you're doing, but I love you and I love the church. Friends, the local church is how God changes you and how God changes the world. I've committed my life to that. I'm taking that to the grave. And what we do here, not in the building necessarily, we saw that last week, but what we do here as a church, it matters. And so there's only one question. Does it matter to you? Does it really, really matter to you? For Christ's sake, for your sake, for Montague's sake. I hope so.